Does anyone remember Ender Lillies' Quietous of the Nights? I reviewed it like 3 years ago during that odd transitionary period of my YouTube channel. As bad as my stuff is at present, it was way worse in the before times, in the long ago. It was a 2D platformer, the game, not my channel. My channel is more of a choose your own adventure where all the pages lead to disappointment. Ender Lillies was pretty good though. I rather enjoyed my time with it, but the funny thing is, after the game got its full release and I grabbed a copy for my PlayStation, I lost all interest in it and promptly forgot that it ever existed. I've tried a few times to play through it. Often I get to the second boss, and after I unlock his power, I put the game down, I promise to return tomorrow, but then come tomorrow, I am always doing something else, like playing Dark Souls or drawing my queer little things. Something about Ender Lillies, I'm not sure what exactly, prevents it from establishing a proper foothold in my mind. I find it difficult to focus on the game for long stretches, and it's not because the game is bad by any means. It's really quite good. It's a solid Metroidvania with a lovely art style, a well-composed soundtrack, and a fun gameplay loop that was engaging to interact with. So what happened? Why did I forget it over and over again? I know I'm a forgetful person by default, but usually something that I only have positive things to say about will maintain a decent residence in my eternally messed up brain, but Ender Lillies, despite doing everything quite well and being a game that I really do like, just doesn't quite make it. I think it's a few little things. Ender Lillies does most of its cutscenes and dialogue in utter silence, with only the background music and maybe the sound of the rain playing, which is lovely and atmospheric, but it doesn't help distinguish the scenes themselves and makes them all quite forgettable. It also tonally doesn't ever leave the bleak or sad vibe that it establishes early on, so perhaps I got a bit emotionally fatigued. There's plenty of smaller areas where the game could do better. The sound effect used for menu selection is very generic and way louder than necessary. Some checkpoints use basic map assets over the distinct checkpoint ones, which feels a bit lazy. Some areas feel a bit uninteresting to explore, but none of these on their own are deal breakers. The game doesn't have one big stumbling block, rather it just sort of trips over its own feet every few paces, and it's only noticeable when you look at the wider picture. Perhaps that's why I don't tend to remember all these little things until I replay the game and they all build up again. But regardless of why, Ender Lillies just doesn't stick with me. I didn't even know the game was getting a sequel that I might add has been in early access since March of last year. Come to think of it, did I ever actually finish the first game? No. No, I didn't. Huh. So going into this I might be a bit confused, but still, a good sequel can serve as both a jumping on point for new fans and something to gratify the existing base. I probably don't need to remind the class that my first Dark Souls game was the third one, or my first trip under the sea to Rapture was Bioshock 2 rather than 1. Hell, I've not even played the early Fallouts. My first one was free. A good sequel is a good game within its own rights, so I wonder, is Ender Magnolia such a sequel? I welcome you, my friends, enemies, and all remaining entities, to today's review of Ender Magnolia Bloom in the Mist. I'm so glad the nonsense titling has remained consistent since the original game. It really does feel like it just found some cool sounding words and threw them together. Let's take a trip to a sci-fi post-apocalypse and see what the game does right, where it falls short, and when all is said and done, if it's worth having a go with. Before we begin proper, a few things. I have a Discord now. If you want to join, there's a link in the description. Feel free to stop by. Just don't be a dickhead if you do, okay? Very basic thing, I think. And if you end up enjoying this video, please do the YouTube things, like, subscribe, comment, all that jazz. It'll be deeply appreciated. And that's all I can remember that I wanted to say. Oh yeah, one more thing. I love you all. That's it. Let's go. As we are discussing a sequel, I fear comparisons to the original title will be as inevitable as a #nice guy holding a door open for you only to call you a bitch when you don't immediately thank him with sex. Fuck me, this is the darkest timeline, isn't it? Like the original game, Ender Magnolia is a side-scrolling action platformer that graduated from the Metroidvania School of Design. The maps are explorable, relatively fast, and often blocked by obstacles that require us to find a power so we can bypass an obstacle. You need the powerful ground pound to break through destructible floors, you need the charging wolf to break through destructible walls, you need the wall climber to climb walls to otherwise unreachable areas, you need the aquatic power so that you can hold your breath underwater and swim, and you need the grapple hook to grapple onto grapple points. Simple enough, right? All the while you'll be surviving the environment and the enemies that occupy it. For controls, we have the left stick for movement. You can attack with either square, circle, triangle, or the right shoulder button. You can dodge with R2, interact with objects like switches or loot items with L2, and you can bring up a map of the local area by pressing the right stick. Generally speaking, the controls are smooth and responsive. I don't recall any instances where the game failed to read my inputs, and I will say it feels generally better to play than the first game. Granted, Ender Lillies was also smooth and responsive, but Ender Magnolia feels more refined and generally like a massive upgrade over the original game. Rather than clumsily falling over to dodge, we do a little dash that feels a lot smoother. Rather than most of our skills having to pull from limited uses, we can attack with reckless abandon. Sure, we can no longer have two sets of combat skills available that we can swap between on the fly, but there are less combat skills in this game to work with, so I guess it makes sense. And I should say that I don't hate that our arsenal feels more limited, because it feels, like the controls, generally more refined. Unlike the first game, when you upgrade a skill in this game, you unlock an entirely different function of that skill. For example, your default sword lady can be upgraded to use a scythe that hits a little bit less hard, but has a far wider arc that can catch more enemies, or you can upgrade her to use an axe which basically flips that around. It has a bit less range but hits significantly harder. The first alternative power you unlock is a girl with a giant robot fist who originally moves horizontally towards a target, but the first upgrade I got made her leap into the air and ground pound to freeze enemies. Or you've got the gun-wielding Angel Femboy whose default bullets are weak but he staggers enemies really quickly, and he can keep up the pressure as long as you're holding the button, but his alternative bullets hit harder and multiple times. We've still got enough variety to keep things interesting, but to be frank, there are less redundant skills to clog up your arsenal. There was this one skill I acquired, a big boy that parries attacks for you, that I think is kind of worthless, but that's just one. And I say he feels worthless because the combat system feels more like it was designed to reward aggression over being a pacifist. Of course, I might just be saying that because his mechanic just doesn't really appeal to my current playstyle. I definitely have gotten more aggressive in video games over the past couple of years, so it's much more likely that he just didn't work for me. After a while, you'll also unlock a new ability that lets you unleash an ultimate strike from any one of your currently equipped skills, so long as your energy bar is full, which I do wish came a little bit sooner because it is a lot of fun to play with, but that's a good problem to have. Besides, the rest of the game is still plenty of fun without it. The combat is quite satisfying, there's a good sense of feedback to your attacks, and most rooms are full of enemies that compensate for one another's shortcomings. Although, granted, there are also quite a few times when a game can be absolutely cheesed and some enemies can be hit through the floor but can't really react to your presence. But then again, I'm a petty bitch who loves a petty victory. Speaking of victory, let's talk about the boss fights. I think the game does these really well, and it managed to make them all feel like the right balance of challenging enough to require focus, but not so tit-twistingly infuriating that I have to microwave another cat in anger, which I have to admit is good news. Peter recently called me to tell me that they wanted to kill all those cats and I was stealing their fun. In case you couldn't tell, that was a joke. That didn't happen. I know I shouldn't have to point that out, but the internet is full of very stupid people. Like there's this one YouTuber who's currently trying to beat Fallout 4 using only the companions, and what an idiot. Oh, wait a minute. Shameless plugs aside though, I do really enjoy the boss fights in Ender Magnolia, partly because they were well designed and had clear patterns but could still punish you for your mistakes, but mostly because they were only ever a few paces from a checkpoint, so failure wasn't too big an issue. Just pick up and try again. Dying in this game never felt like a roadblock, always more of a brief stumble. The game understands that by dying I have to already redo the bit that I just died to, but better this time, so it doesn't try to punish you beyond that. It's a game that doesn't seem to want to punch you whilst you're down, and I really appreciate that. Honestly, I have very little to complain about mechanically. I guess there are a couple of maps that are sort of awkward feeling to navigate, but then again, I never really got lost, so it can't have been that bad. I like that we can basically fast travel between checkpoints from the get-go, and I don't even dislike how we have to swap between our skills and equipment at a checkpoint. Like, sure, logically I should be able to swap between what hat I'm wearing as I wander, but I personally prefer to be in a safe space before I piss around with my gear anyway, so I can't really say it's a bad design choice. This was something else that the first game did, and honestly, I never minded it. Something else that both games do is that they constantly reward the player for exploring, not by just having new relics to find. Relics, by the way, are the little items that grant you perks when equipped, but also through these lore notes that the story addict in me is all for, and the constant finding of these little fragments that permanently boost your maximum HP by 5 points. They're all over the damn place. Yeah, it's hard for me to find something to legitimately complain about on a mechanical level. The game is quite well designed and put together with both competence and talent. I guess I did get a bit annoyed when one relic didn't work like it was supposed to. It's basically meant to restore you to full HP when you die once per checkpoint visit, but sometimes it just wouldn't. I think it's a bit buggy. And I suppose I don't love the sounds used for confirming your menu choices. They're a bit loud by default and feel very generic, but that's not exactly the hardest thing to work around. There is one mechanical choice that does sort of irritate me more significantly, but that's best left for the story section given its relation to the dialogue and interactions. I think I could say that I'm not overly fond of the new graphical style. I mean, granted, it is very similar to the original game. It just looks a bit cleaner and almost like it's missing about 9% of the original charm, but like with the relic thing and the noises the menu made, it was such a small gripe that it was almost not worth mentioning. But then again, I am British, and if we don't find something to complain about, we wither and die. The graphics are quite good though. Despite what I said, the game does have a very nice visual style, with a lot of detail in the character design and background art that make being in this world a lot more enjoyable. Like the original game, there is a bleakness to this world, but it's also a sense of hope. There can be beauty in destruction after all. I would also be remiss if I didn't bring up the music. It does a really good job of communicating the atmosphere of the areas we explore, and like the visuals, there is a sense of melancholy, but there's also something kind of lively about them that keeps me going. The first game had a noticeable tonal problem, which was present in both the narrative and the audio visuals. The game was miserable and bleak, which is fine. I am a Souls fan after all. I can dig this, but it does get a bit exhausting after a while. Ender Magnolia, however, remembered to make its various background music a bit more lively to keep the energy up, and it did so without sacrificing the overall ambience it was trying to create. I realised that last month I didn't even really talk about the music of the subject game, Project Tower, and that's because the music tracks outside of the one it used as a boss fight theme were so bafflingly calm and pleasant that they clashed with the relative bleakness of the game's narrative so hard that my brain essentially eventually deleted the information. I am glad to have played this month a game that understands how to do music properly, as well as gameplay, and level design, and fun. Let's summarise the gameplay bit. Whilst there are a couple of small design decisions that don't really work for me, I am quite happy to say that Ender Magnolia is a fun game to play. I'd say it's better than the original game, and the original game was very good. So when I say that, I don't mean it as a derogatory remark about the quality of the first game. We have combat that has a good sense of flow and feedback, an explorable world that was always ready to reward the player for their curiosity, a good sense of progression as new areas become available to us as we acquire new powers to traverse them, and the bosses are an absolute delight. Ender Magnolia Bloom in the Mist is a bloody good game and definitely worth a look. Even if you've not played the original, I'd say it's fun enough to be worth jumping straight into. Now we press on to the story to discuss why, despite the relative quality of the narrative being respectable, the way in which it's delivered often left me feeling indifferent or uninvested. The story of Ender Magnolia, Bloom in the Mist, follows a young girl named Lilac on her quest to rediscover her lost memories whilst navigating a world beset by a calamity which is pretty much just a blight from the first game, only called something different. To be fair, the game is still set in the same world as the original title, about a century or so later I'd say, given the fact that we've gone from fantasy to sci-fi. That's how you know we're in the future. But who is Lilac exactly? Well, she's an attuner, and in this world that means that those spirits that serve as her weapons, yeah, she's responsible for keeping them focused and sane via attuning them every so often. The spirits, or rather homunculi as the game calls them this time around, are artificial beings made through some sort of magical method that fill a variety of roles in this world. Some are miners, some are gatherers, some are scrappers, and some are peacekeepers, you get it. However, these beings will occasionally lose their way and kind of require people like Lilac to keep them in line. The main narrative focus is on getting Lilac to remember her past, and also along the way maybe we can figure out what the hell happened to the world. Well, actually we already kind of know what happened to the world. Basically like the Blight did from the original game, the fumes are descending upon the land and making people go mad and mutate. But I will be fair here, given that we are many years in the future, it does make some level of sense that the people might call the same phenomena something else if they've never experienced it directly. Lilac fills a very similar role to the girl from the first game in this regard. She's seemingly immune to the effects of the fumes herself, and once she beats down the homunculi who have gone mad due to exposure, she can make them friendly again. Although unlike the original girl, she can't just make any dead person into her servant, it only works on homunculi. We get most of the story by defeating the bosses and speaking to the NPCs that tend to spawn after this happens, also through these lore notes we find on the floor. And whilst I do have one issue regarding the plot, I don't really feel myself in a spoiling mood. If you know me, you know I only really tend to reveal the secrets of a game when I dislike it, but as I quite like Ender Magnolia, I won't go that far. So we're going to keep this bit a bit vague, and have it serve as more of a recounting of my enjoyment of the story rather than a reveal of the specific events. Plus, for quite a lot of the run there's not a whole lot to spoil, we are mostly just being given excuses to explore the world, usually because we need an item that's been lost or a boss with a power we need can be found elsewhere. A fair amount of the world's lore is resigned to the notes that we can pick up along our journey, which, like audio logs and diary entries in other video games, is something I'm just willing to accept as a necessity of this particular medium. But again, without wishing to spoil, I don't dislike the story I've been told. As far as lore dumps and exposition go, the game rather effectively paints a picture of a somewhat bleak world where creatures are brought into existence only to serve, and are more considered tools than sapient beings. We've also got a pretty decent sense that there's some sort of ruling elite that could be pulling all the strings and might even be responsible for the fumes themselves, but cards on the table, I couldn't tell you for certain since I still haven't finished the game. I won't say that I've disliked anything that's gotten through my brain, but I do think there are a few shortcomings worth mentioning. For instance, it's hard for me to say if there's even one character that I think stands out to me. I guess the Angel Femboy is probably my favourite because it combines the three things I love: guns, angels and femboys, but it's mostly a surface level thing. He does seem nice enough, but I had trouble focusing on his or anyone else's dialogue for that matter. There is a single reason for this, and I'm going to use it to reiterate why I think a designer should be very wary of how even the smallest design decision can fundamentally alter the way a player interacts with or experiences your video game. Dialogue, even in cutscenes, is utterly silent. Now, don't misunderstand, I am not upset or bothered that the game has no voice acting. I know voice acting is expensive, time consuming, and it also requires a director who knows how to, well, direct the actor properly. Some of my absolute favourite video games of all time completely lack any voice acting or dialogue, yet communicate their stories just fine. Let me use an example to illustrate what I actually mean. Stardew Valley dialogue is also unvoiced, but it's accompanied by simple noises that sort of punctuate the sentences, but Ender Magnolia has nothing of the sort. The voice lines are utterly silent, all we have is the ambient music, lovely though it is, and I do find this particular method of delivery to be utterly lifeless. minutes. My eyes tended to glaze over whenever the game entered one of its character interaction scenes. I struggle with focus at the best of times, especially when reading. I'm a really poor reader, and having an audible cue really does help when engaging with dialogue in video games. Without it, it feels almost soulless. I know it's an incredibly small design choice, and plenty of folks might not even notice this sort of thing, but I did, and I'm now making it your problem. If I'm being honest though, this is the biggest issue I had with the story, the way in which it is told. In terms of content, there's nothing to really complain about. There is a valiant effort to characterise our party of spirits. You've got Nola, who's kind of uptight, but the girl with the robot fist, whose name presently escapes me, is kind of pessimistic, but also kind of enthralled by the world that she's exploring. You've got the angel boy, who's very dutiful, and Lilac herself has this hopeful and upbeat attitude that pushes her ever onwards despite the fact that she knows nothing. Perhaps it's her innocence that makes her so positive. She doesn't know exactly how fucked things are because she literally can't remember shit. Whilst the emoting might be a bit light on the ground, the actual narrative thread isn't bad or overly hard to follow. We're looking for answers, and people and homunculi often have some. We battle with the latter because they're going mad. They don't really mean to harm us, but they've gone too long without being attuned. Luckily, that's Lilac's whole job, and the way she constantly saves them would likely reinforce her own relatively sunny disposition, because she is essentially giving herself hope over and over again. Ultimately, we're trying to make our way to the shiny, clean-looking sanctuary that looms above the city at all times, because there's almost certainly going to be information in a place that's housed entirely by scholars and mages. Definitely about the world, hopefully about ourselves. A dude guards the approach, which is logical, what with the mutant problem, but through dialogue it's clear that there's something more he's trying to hide, and our presence complicates matters. I also can't fault him for turning tail and running after I rip his fucking arm off. That's perfectly reasonable. Ender Magnolia doesn't have a bad story. Sure, there are some elements that are a bit cliche. The blight, or fumes in this case, come to mind. There being this sort of wibbly wobbly badness thing that mutates people is a bit overdone, to say the least, and I do think that no, I actually can't really think of anything else I want to bring up. Like I said earlier, I'm not really in a spoiling mood. It's kind of what happens when a game is, you know, good and doesn't make me want to stab my own hands just to feel something. Enter Magnolia plot-wise does have some more elements over the first game that I enjoyed. Like, for example, I like that our protagonist's role in this world is a bit more specific, and the world itself definitely feels a bit more lively given that we have plenty of living characters to converse with. I feel like there's a real world here with a good sense of history. Enter Magnolia's narrative, as it stands, is perfectly satisfactory in terms of content, and only really stumbles because of how it was presented, and I do also accept that I am brain spicy, so it's probably just a me problem. It's not badly paced and it's quite well written. Of course, because my focus was ever eluding me even when rewatching the footage for this section of the review, I could also be misremembering the plot, and there could be significant holes in it, but until I get past the issue, I can't really judge. I don't know if that's a good or bad thing, I just know that it's a thing. Enter Magnolia is a good game. It's fun to play, it's nice to look at and listen to, it strikes a good challenge balance, and whilst I found the story a bit difficult to focus on, I didn't think it was a bad story. My biggest gripes are all fairly small, but I must confess that I haven't played the game in like 2 weeks. I defeated the Gilroy boss, explored a bit of the next area, but then just sort of forgot about it, similar to how I forgot about the first game, although at least this one I made it significantly further into. I am going to try and get through it though. The game cost me about 20-ish quid, like Project Tower did last month actually, but unlike that waste of digital space, Ender Magnolia feels like a more realised experience, and to be frank, it feels like it's made by people who seem to have some fucking talent. Okay, that was a bit mean. Still though, it's amazing how both games shared the same basic price range, and one feels like a fully made, well-tested and fun to experience adventure that made me feel actual delight, whereas the other feels like a cheap mess that you'd find in a supermarket bargain bin with like 3 different reduced labels applied to the box. 20 quid feels like an incredibly good price for Ender M. Hell, if it was like 30 I'd still probably be quite pleased. It's a nice game that I think people should check out, so yeah, I'm recommending this one. Definitely have a look at it if you get a chance. I've had plenty of fun and maybe you will too. And I think with that said and done, we can wrap up here. Thank you for watching. I do hope you enjoyed my review. Feel free to let me know what you thought in the comments. And with that, I'll let you go. Thanks again for being here. It means the world to me. I love you all so much and I'll see you next time. Oh, and don't forget the Discord and you're already gone.